In reform movements of this time, perfectionism was also being achieved not just through the Second Great Awakening, not just through transcendentalism, trying to, as Emerson said, know thyself, but also through utopian societies. You saw almost 100 or a few more perfectionist communities setting up, trying to do what the Mormons were trying to do what the Pilgrims and Puritans were trying to do to set up a new perfect society here on earth. Individuals trying to do this ran into many challenges, though. Among the challenges that are as age-old as what the Puritans found, what anyone with utopian aspirations discovers. When you get the group together, and the group is finally confronted with an issue with which the entire group does not agree, then the group falls apart because there's no gel or binding commitment that has to hold that group together. And so you've seen among these groups such as Brook Farm, Harmony, and Oneida and the Shakers, and the Amana community as well, very few of these groups had long-lasting presence because they either had issues with dividing up the work, or they had issues with what their common philosophy and goal was. And these things in a society that championed the individual as much as America does and did, allowed for these individuals to break off and splinter off with their own small factions, trying to form their own communal society, which then could have limited reach and success as well. Internal disagreements almost make it impossible for these groups to have a long, lasting future. For the most part, they would disappear, despite all their perfectionist aspirations. But that gives you a real tenor for the times. The idea was to try to perfect society on earth through perfecting consciousness, through perfecting social relationships, and also through perfecting institutions such as education, but also, in many ways, societal reform. What were the wrongs of society that needed to be righted? We've already hinted at abolition a little bit. William Lloyd Garrison, with the Liberator in 1831, starts proclaiming that slavery is sin, and as such, those that practice it are really bad people, to put it nicely. And slavery needs to be done away with, and it's doing the work of the Lord to do so, is the way that Garrison would have seen it. The American Colonization Society in 1817 was a more benign attempt to deal with this. The first attempt was to set up states such as Liberia in Africa, with its capital of Monrovia, named for James Monroe. Set up a state in Africa through which American slaves could be transshipped back across the Atlantic, almost the Middle Passage in reverse. This winds up being a wildly impractical solution, A, because Southern whites don't want to give up their slaves, B, because even if they did, the government wasn't going to find the money to compensate them for the amount of compensation that was going to cost, and C, it's fantasy to say that you can take a people who've been here for 400 years or 300 years and then uproot them from here, return them back to sub-Saharan Africa and say, you'll fit right in and do just fine. For lack of any other description of it, these people are no longer African Americans. They're more American with an African heritage, African background. They couldn't have just dropped right back into society and culture. And so this model really wouldn't have worked very well. And despite there were those that thought this is the easiest way, the most nonviolent way to deal with slavery, this model never got anywhere. With Nat Turner's rebellion during this time period as well, a violent act in a time that was not necessarily always about violence, but about achieving perfectionist aspirations, this violence was in some reforming quarters seen as the avenging angel's solution, the Lord's solution to the problem of dealing with sin. However, this was seen in the South as being wildly hypocritical or even dangerous for the Northern agents to be training and educating slaves to do bad things to their Southern masters, or for slaves to get education from Northerners at all on abolitionist tracts, and then use this information to say that slavery was sin and wrong, and have African Americans like Nat Turner take things into their own hands and start their own slave rebellion. Remember, Nat Turner, for his part, thought that he was acting as an angel of God. He thought he was hearing voices, much in a Joan of Arc sense, thought that he was hearing voices from God telling him that it was his duty to rise up with his fellow slaves, get these slaves with him, and murder whites and just to destroy slavery. Not all whites, but murder the whites involved in slavery to destroy slavery. This becomes the South's worst nightmare. And as such, the South begins to take steps to really rein in the freedom of discussion on this notion of abolition in the South. And it provides tension between what the South wants versus what you're seeing transcendentalists say about obeying higher laws. And if you're obeying higher laws, you need to obey them by any means necessary. Maybe a slave rebellion is justified then. And this is not the kind of dialogue that the South wants to hear or take any part in at all. So as such, we see the Southerners starting to move in a divergent direction on some of these reforms. Frederick Douglass, a slave who escapes to freedom, buys his own freedom, publishes his own autobiography, engages in this slavery fight. As we see the abolitionist movement gradually begin to organize, we are not quite at the phase yet of many things you've heard of, such as the Underground Railroad and Fugitive Slave Acts, but those things are coming. So we'll see down the road here shortly this abolitionist movement as an undercurrent gradually grow and extend its voice through time. We're seeing it now as being the far fringe of Northern political thought, and that's going to not stay that way. It'll gradually get a broader voice of that political thought over time. Prison reform should tie you in nicely into the romanticism of the era. Think Dorothea Dix, you know her name already from your classes, in terms of changing the names of prisons, changing them into names like penitentiaries and reformatories. Penitentiary has in it the word penance or penitent, which is being knowledgeable of the fact that I've done wrong and asking for and seeking my forgiveness for this. This is different than the idea of a prison, which was just lock you up because you've been bad and we don't care what happens to you. We see a reformatory spirit, the idea that humans can be perfected, humans can be made better. We can take these people and correct their behavior, hence a correctional institution. We can make them productive members of society again. This plays very nicely into the elements that we're seeing of this Second Great Awakening, where all people had value. There was hope and salvation for all, and the reform spinning out of this movement, taking it into nuts and bolts concrete terms, means all human souls have worth and value, even those that are incarcerated. So we see movements towards improving conditions for the insane in asylums, improving conditions for criminals and convicts in their prisons. In terms of the women's movement, it also ties in nicely to anti-slavery because both saw themselves as oppressed people. It is no coincidence. Everything happens for a reason. It is no coincidence that women got actively involved. White middle-class women got actively involved in the abolitionist movement during this time because the common ethic of the day was you had two similarly oppressed peoples, and if the African-American male was going to be given the right to citizenship, it seemed to white middle-class women, it would be impossible to deny them that same right at the same time that you gave it to this former ex-slave. So the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 with Susan B. Anthony deliberately mimicked the Declaration of Independence, not talking about the tyranny of England over its colonies, but talking about the tyranny of men over women. They specifically, you could call it plagiarizing, but that wasn't the point. They specifically used the document's phraseology on purpose because they wanted to make the point that women were a subjugated, tyrannized gender, just as the Americans had felt themselves to be a subjugated, tyrannized, colony of people, species of people under the British Empire. The last of our reforms that we'll talk about of any great lasting impact was in some ways you could argue the most successful, besides women's suffrage. Even though that takes 100 years, this reform takes just about as long as well. Those two together, temperance. Temperance being the anti-alcohol movement. During this time, you see alcohol and alcoholism as being a problem in American society. It corrupted and destroyed the family in many ways. It made life difficult for workers in the workplace. Bosses and foremen didn't like it because it increased absenteeism, decreased productivity. Many immigrants coming in had alcohol as part of their culture, and particularly within the Roman Catholic Church, the notion of alcohol and wine as part of the sacraments and the services. But you saw that the idea was to maybe try to diminish it first and then ban outright alcoholic use within the United States. A dry nation, they thought, was perfecting human sensibilities by taking away the temptations of vice and corruption that comes with it. Alcohol, they thought, brought with it a host of other things. Prostitution, gambling, vice, violence, destruction of the family. Many of the kind of things that you hear in the war on drugs kind of language you hear being in today's common conversations is the language you saw for the language of why temperance was a vital and important part of the movement of this time to progressively improve the American social experience. Now, progressivism in this sense is a movement that's far later on down the line. And progressivism in this sense in the 1920s is when we'll see nationwide prohibition take place. But this is a movement that actually does not start at the federal level. It starts, as you know, at the state and local level with Neil Dow, the American Temperance Society, and the Maine laws Maine being the first state to go dry in 1851, and it's going to be a long, gradual march from there, state by state by state, community and region by community and region, to get to the point by the 20th century where Americans, a majority at least, a simple majority at least, think prohibition is worth doing, it's bound, and they're bound to give it a try. Of course, as they try, that's going to be with its own disastrous results, but that's a story for a different lesson, a different unit. But these antebellum reform movements that we're seeing here, in many ways, they're going to tie in with two key elements: evangelicalism and the idea of taking religion and transforming religious evangelicalism into specific, tangible, concrete deeds and words and events that can make society better here and now. So you'll move from the evangelical in some ways to the secular, as you're going to have people trying to make this world better. And of course, the ultimate thing that's going to try to make this world better is to, maybe in this generation, this time we're talking about, stop having persons enslave other persons. And that's going to light the fuse to a very big powder keg which comes down the road as slavery and what's going to become of slavery on the frontier and serious divisions over slavery in the Western territories starts to become the dominant topic of American thinking. This, which we've seen in this unit, sets the table for some of that as backstory to some critical issues that are to come and are to follow.